How are you, Africa? Welcome to PanAfricanism Through Poetry with Moses Tofa. Today's poem is titled, Africa's Choiceless Choices Between Coups and Unconstitutionally Elected Governments. Africa, you are caught between a rock and a hard place, between coups and unconstitutionally elected governments. When you gained independence, coups were the order of the day. This was understandable because you were still experimenting with democracy after decades of colonial rule. Because you were caught between two ideological foundations that fought against each other. You walked towards democracy, but always faltered along the way. Nonetheless, you made some gains towards the elimination of coups. It is tragic that more than 6 decades after independence, coups have come back. You are morphing into the epicenter of coups. Why is this so, Africa? What is the solution? To understand the resurgence of unconstitutional change of governments in Africa, we must first establish what a constitutionally elected government is. A constitutionally elected government must meet these 5 non-negotiable pillars. It must have been elected through free, fair, and credible elections. It must have the commitment to deliver the wishes of the masses. It must have the commitment to build strong and independent institutions. It must have the commitment to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. It must have the commitment to defend the nation from imperialism. Africa, your tragedy is that you have mutilated the meaning of a constitutional government. A government whose officials are conscious of imperialism is not constitutional. A government that steals elections season in and season out is not constitutional. A government that releases results under the cover of darkness is not constitutional. A government that erases constitutional term limits to remain in power is not constitutional. A government that abuses the law and state institutions to stifle and criminalize democratic rights is not constitutional. A government whose officials loot the honesty shop while citizens use a death trap health delivery system is not constitutional. A government that leads a nation whose wealth does not trickle down to the masses is not constitutional. Africa, you are witnessing a resurgence of coups, even though you have multiple normative frameworks that condemn coups. This is because the condemnation of coups does not dwell in normative frameworks, but it dwells in the demonstrable commitment by governments to be elected or rejected through credible elections, to govern transparently and inclusively, to build credible and independent institutions, to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, to gain the trust of the masses, and to reasonably meet the expectations of the masses. Africa, the condemnation of military coups is not found in condemning military coups, but in curing their causes. The condemnation of military coups by African leaders must be seen not in how harshly they condemn military coups, but in how harshly they condemn fraudulent elections. Because it is in and through the condemnation of fraudulent elections that military coups are meaningfully condemned. And it is in and through the condoning of fraudulent elections that military coups are condoned. Africa, when your leaders condone fraudulent elections, they simultaneously condone military coups, because fraudulent elections and military coups are identical. There is no difference between an electoral coup and a military coup, because these two share the same blood. The former begets the latter. No person with a clean conscience can condone one but condemn the other. No person with a clean conscience can keep quiet when elections are brazenly rigged, but speak out when the election fraudster has been removed from power through a military coup. No person with a clean conscience can gravely get concerned when a military coup takes place, but cannot get gravely concerned when elections are brazenly rigged. No person with a clean conscience can call for the restoration of a constitutional order that never existed in the first place. Africa, whenever a government closes all the avenues of constitutional transfer of power, it wittingly creates the pathway for its unconstitutional removal from power. If an unconstitutionally elected government happens to be unconstitutionally removed from power, it does not have the constitutional authority to claim that it was unconstitutionally removed from power. The unconstitutional removal of an unconstitutionally elected government is constitutional in the court of the oppressed. That is why coups are being celebrated across Africa, especially by the young people. Africa, I am not saying that military coups are the solution. There is need to be alert to the dangers and pitfalls of military coups. The euphoria that engulfs the removal of autocratic regimes through military coups is understandable because it is based on the feeling that a lifelong burden has been lifted from the shoulders of the nation. It comes from the feeling that a diabolical chapter has been closed and a new one has arrived. But this euphoria does not build a nation, because the removal of a vile regime through a military coup is not an idea, it is not an ideology. It is not synonymous with the building of a democratic and a progressive nation. The removal is one thing and the building is another. These two are worlds apart from each other. The removal belongs to the world of anger, but the building belongs to the world of ideas. Anger without ideas is a blind alley. Africa, societies are transformed by big ideas and the commitment to implement them. Military regimes are often bereft of ideas. They are in the same league as the regime which they would have ousted from power. Africa, history has taught you that coups set a wrong precedent because they beget coups. They bring a false sense of liberation, an ephemeral atmosphere of change. Citizens have offered goodwill to military coups before, but military regimes are notorious for squandering the goodwill. Once they get into power, they turn against the very citizens who gave them the goodwill. They open fire against the goodwill. They turn evil for good. Africa, unconstitutionally elected regimes and military regimes are equally bad. You must condemn both of them in equal measure. Do not believe that one is better than the other. You must discard both of them in the dustbin. Africa, you have amazing guidelines governing democratic elections. These guidelines are your only weapon against military coups, but only if you strictly enforce them. You must have zero tolerance for any deviation from the guidelines. You must hold each other to brutal accounts. Africa, the empire vowed that it will never die. Some of the coups are a manifestation of the people's anger against the empire. As long as imperialism continues to loot Africa's treasury, these coups will not stop. As long as imperialism continues to meddle in the internal affairs of Africa, these coups will not stop. These coups can be stopped by building a bulwark against imperialism. Africa, if a regime that is a conduit of imperialism is removed from power through a military coup, it does not have the Pan-African authority to claim that it was unconstitutionally removed from power. Thank you, Africa. This is Moses Tofa. Pan-Africanism through poetry, inspiring Africa, raising consciousness. Amandla.